The morning sun was just breaking through the trees when I saw them. Dozens of silver bodies floating belly up across the crystal clear water that had been my sanctuary for months. The chemical smell hit my nostrils like a punch to the gut. Bleach. Someone had deliberately poisoned the lake. I stood there on the dock, my fishing rod trembling in my hands, watching years of aquatic life destroyed in a single night. The water that had sparkled like diamonds just yesterday now looked cloudy and sick. Dead bass, bluegill, and catfish bobbed on the surface like accusations. Then I heard her voice behind me, sweet as honey, cold as ice. "Well, I guess you will not be fishing here anymore." I turned to see Karen Stephanie, the HOA president, standing on her pristine lawn in her white tennis outfit. Her smile never reached her eyes, but her satisfaction was unmistakable. She had won, or so she thought. That was the moment I realized this suburban housewife had just committed environmental terrorism, and she had no idea what kind of fight she had just started. 6 months earlier, I thought I had found paradise. The lakeside community of Willowbrook Estates stretched out before me like something from a dream. Pristine homes with manicured lawns rolled down to private docks, and the centerpiece was a stunning 40-acre lake that sparkled in the morning sun. I had been unemployed for 8 months after the factory closure, and the stress was eating me alive. My savings were dwindling, my confidence was shot, and I desperately needed something to keep me sane while I searched for work. That something was fishing. The lake called to me from the moment I saw the rental listing. Crystal clear water, abundant fish species, and peaceful mornings that promised healing for my battered soul. The rent was steep for my budget, but the landlord assured me that lake access was included for all residents. The HOA rules were clearly posted, and fishing was explicitly permitted with proper licensing. Every morning at 5:30, I would grab my tackle box and walk down to the community dock. The mist would rise from the glass-smooth surface as I cast my line into the silence. The therapeutic rhythm of casting and reeling became my meditation. Each fish I caught and released represented hope, a sign that life could still surprise me with good things. The other residents seemed friendly enough. Retirees walking their dogs would wave and ask about my catch. Young families would bring their children to feed the ducks. Everyone seemed to coexist peacefully in this slice of suburban heaven. The HOA appeared professional and reasonable. They maintained beautiful common areas, kept the streets clean, and the rules seemed straightforward. The monthly meetings were well attended, and the board members all lived in the community. I even attended a few meetings myself, wanting to be a good neighbor and stay informed about community affairs. I followed every fishing regulation to the letter. I had my state fishing license, I practiced catch and release, I cleaned up after myself religiously, and I never fished during posted restricted hours. The lake was stocked regularly and the fish population was thriving. Bass, bluegill, catfish, and even some trout kept me busy every morning. Those early morning hours became sacred to me. The stress of job interviews and rejection letters would melt away as I watched my bobber dance on the gentle waves. The sunrise painted the water gold and pink, and I felt truly at peace for the first time in months. But even in paradise, I should have noticed the warning signs. The way some residents would hurry past without making eye contact. The perfectly maintained appearance that seemed almost too pristine, as if any deviation from the ideal would not be tolerated. The subtle sense that I was being watched and evaluated. I was so grateful for the tranquility and the healing that fishing provided that I ignored my instincts. This was my sanctuary, my lifeline during the darkest period of my adult life. I could not imagine that anyone would want to take that away from me. Looking back, I realized that my contentment made me naive. I assumed that reasonable people could coexist peacefully, that following the rules would be enough, and that the beauty of this place reflected the character of its residents. I was about to learn how wrong I was. The first hint of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in late September. I found a handwritten note tucked under my car windshield wiper, written on expensive cream-colored stationery with perfectly neat cursive handwriting. Dear resident, while fishing is technically permitted, we hope all community members will exercise proper etiquette and consideration for others who prefer quieter lake activities. Please be mindful of noise levels and the visual impact of fishing equipment. Thank you for your cooperation. The management. I read it twice, confused. I had never made excessive noise, never left equipment lying around, and I fished from the designated community dock during permitted hours. What exactly was improper about my etiquette? That afternoon, I met her for the first time. Karen Stephanie, HOA president and self-appointed guardian of community standards. She appeared on the dock while I was cleaning my tackle box after a successful morning catch. "You must be our fisherman," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of polite disdain that some people perfect over years of suburban politics. She was perfectly put together in white tennis attire, not a hair out of place despite the morning humidity. Her smile was practiced and cold, never quite reaching her pale blue eyes. She carried a clipboard like a weapon and positioned herself between me and the path back to my apartment. "I am Karen Stephanie, HOA president. I wanted to personally welcome you to our community and discuss some concerns that have been brought to my attention." "Concerns about what exactly?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. "Well, some residents have mentioned that your fishing activities are somewhat intensive. We want to make sure everyone can enjoy the lake equally." I looked around the empty shoreline. It was 7 in the morning on a weekday. The only other person in sight was an elderly man walking his small dog on the far side of the lake. "I have been very careful to follow all posted rules," I said. "I fish during permitted hours, I have proper licensing, and I always clean up after myself." Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, of course. We just want to maintain the peaceful atmosphere that makes our community so special. Perhaps you could consider fishing less frequently, or maybe exploring some of the other lovely lakes in the county." The suggestion hit me like a slap. This was not a friendly welcome or a reasonable request for accommodation. This was the opening move in a campaign to drive me away from the one thing that was keeping me sane. "I will continue to follow the posted rules," I said carefully. "Fishing is permitted for residents, and I am a resident." Something flickered behind her eyes. Not anger exactly, but a cold calculation that made my skin crawl. "Well, yes, technically that is correct. I just hope we can all be good neighbors." She turned and walked away, her tennis shoes silent on the wooden dock, but I could feel her watching from her kitchen window as I packed up my gear. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things that had not registered before. The other anglers who used to fish in the evenings had mysteriously disappeared. When I asked the tackle shop owner in town, he mentioned that several customers from Willowbrook had stopped coming in over the past few months. "Shame too," he said. "That lake has some of the best bass fishing in the county, but folks said the HOA was making things difficult." I found dead fish floating near my usual spot on 3 separate occasions. Small ones, mostly bluegill and sunfish. They looked fresh, not like they had died from disease or natural causes. Each time, I reported it to the HOA maintenance request system, but received only generic responses about natural fish mortality in lake ecosystems. Karen Stephanie started appearing during my fishing sessions with increasing frequency. She would stand on her back patio, coffee cup in hand, watching me with undisguised disapproval. Sometimes she would walk her small white dog along the shoreline, always stopping to observe my activities before continuing on her way. I began documenting everything: photos of my fishing license, pictures of the area before and after each session to prove I left no trace, timestamps of my arrivals and departures. Something told me I would need evidence of my compliance with community rules. My instincts were screaming that trouble was coming, but my logical mind kept dismissing these concerns as paranoia. After all, what could they really do? Fishing was explicitly allowed in the community bylaws. I was paying rent, following rules, and bothering no one. I had no idea that Karen Stephanie had already decided I did not belong in her vision of lakeside perfection, and she was about to escalate far beyond passive-aggressive notes and disapproving stares. October 15th will be burned into my memory forever. I woke up at 5:15 as usual, grabbed my coffee and tackle box, and headed down to the dock for what I hoped would be a peaceful morning of fishing before job interviews later that day. The smell hit me before I even reached the water. Sharp, chemical, wrong, like swimming pool maintenance gone horribly bad. The lake that had sparkled like diamonds in previous sunrises now looked cloudy and sick, with an oily film across the surface. Then I saw the fish. Dozens of them. Bass, bluegill, catfish, even some of the smaller sunfish, all floating belly up across the fishing area. Silver bodies bumped against each other in the gentle morning breeze, their lifeless eyes reflecting the crime that had been committed under cover of darkness. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. The devastation was overwhelming. These were not just fish to me. They were the living proof that nature could still provide beauty and peace in a world that seemed determined to crush both. The chemical smell was so strong it burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. Bleach. Someone had deliberately dumped bleach into the lake ecosystem, knowing exactly what it would do to every living thing in the water. Well, I guess you will not be fishing here anymore. I spun around to find Karen Stephanie standing on her immaculate back lawn, still in her silk robe and slippers, holding a steaming coffee mug. Her voice was honey-sweet, but her satisfaction was unmistakable. "What happened here?" I demanded, though we both knew she had the answer. "Oh my, it looks like some kind of fish die-off. Terrible shame. These things happen in lake ecosystems sometimes. Natural causes, you know." Natural causes. She stood there lying to my face while the evidence of environmental terrorism floated between us. The woman who had spent weeks trying to convince me to fish elsewhere had just poisoned an entire ecosystem to get her way. "This is bleach," I said, my voice barely controlled. "Someone dumped bleach in the water." Her eyes went cold and sharp. "That is a very serious accusation. I hope you are not suggesting that anyone in this community would do such a thing. We are all very committed to environmental stewardship here." Environmental stewardship. The audacity of those words while standing over dozens of poisoned fish was breathtaking. I spent the rest of the morning collecting water samples in empty coffee jars and photographing the devastation from every angle. The dead fish kept washing up on shore throughout the day, and the chemical smell persisted for hours. That afternoon, I drove to the county environmental office to file a formal complaint. The receptionist was sympathetic but not particularly hopeful. "HOA disputes are tricky," she explained. unless we can prove deliberate contamination, and unless it affects water beyond the community boundaries, our authority is limited. But I was not giving up. That evening, I accessed the community security camera system through the resident portal. The cameras covered common areas including the dock and shoreline. If someone had dumped chemicals, there might be footage. What I found made my blood boil. At 2:15 in the morning, three figures in dark clothing had approached the fishing area with large containers. The footage was grainy, but I could make out the HOA maintenance golf cart and what appeared to be commercial bleach jugs. They systematically poured the contents into the water near the dock and along the shoreline where fish typically gathered. The deliberate, methodical nature of the poisoning was chilling. This was not vandalism or a prank. This was calculated environmental terrorism designed to eliminate activity that one person found objectionable. The next morning brought a formal HOA violation notice in my mailbox, printed on official letterhead with Karen Stephanie's signature. Violation: disturbing community harmony through activities that create tension among residents. Fine: $250. Please remit payment within 10 days or face additional penalties. Disturbing community harmony: they had poisoned a lake ecosystem, committed federal environmental crimes, and destroyed months of aquatic recovery, and somehow I was the one disturbing harmony. I sat in my small apartment that evening, staring at the violation notice and the photos of dead fish on my phone. The peaceful sanctuary that had kept me sane during unemployment was gone, replaced by a toxic waste site that would take months or years to recover. But Karen Stephanie had made a critical error. She assumed I would be intimidated into silence, that I would pack up and leave rather than fight back against HOA authority and social pressure. She had no idea that destroying something I loved would not make me retreat. It would make me fight harder than she could possibly imagine. The war for Willowbrook Lake was just beginning. The next 2 weeks turned into a bureaucratic nightmare that would have been comical if it were not so infuriating. I filed complaints with the County Environmental Office, the State Fish and Wildlife Department, the EPA Regional Office, and even the local police. Each agency passed me to another department, cited jurisdictional limitations, or requested additional documentation that seemed designed to discourage follow-up. Meanwhile, Karen Stephanie launched her own campaign of escalation that revealed the true scope of HOA tyranny when left unchecked. The fines arrived daily: parking violations for being 3 inches over the designated apartment boundary, architectural compliance issues for hanging a small American flag from my balcony, noise complaints for alleged excessive door closing during my job interview schedule. Each violation carried fees ranging from $50 to $300. "You are becoming quite the problem resident," Karen informed me during one of her surprise inspections of the common areas while I was checking my mailbox. "Perhaps you would be happier in a community that better suits your lifestyle." Her passive-aggressive warfare was relentless and creative. She filed complaints about my visitors, despite the fact that I had barely had any guests since moving in. She claimed my fishing equipment storage violated community aesthetics, even though I kept everything neatly organized in my assigned storage closet. But her biggest mistake was overconfidence. The paper trail she was creating documented a pattern of harassment that would become crucial evidence later. I scheduled a consultation with environmental lawyer David Chen, recommended by a contact at the State Environmental Office. Chen was a soft-spoken man in his 40s who specialized in cases involving HOA overreach and environmental violations. This is more complex than a typical neighbor dispute, he explained after reviewing my documentation. The deliberate contamination of water resources crosses into federal jurisdiction, regardless of HOA authority. But proving intent and holding individuals accountable will require substantial evidence. He was encouraged by the security camera footage and the systematic nature of the harassment I was experiencing. Pattern evidence is powerful in environmental cases. If they are willing to poison a lake to eliminate fishing, what other corners are they cutting in environmental management? That question led to my next discovery. Through public records requests, I obtained HOA financial documents that revealed suspicious patterns in maintenance spending. Large payments to environmental services companies that did not appear to provide legitimate ecological management. I also reached out to former residents who had left the community over the past 2 years. 3 of them agreed to speak with me confidentially, and their stories were disturbing. Mark Torres had been forced out after his children were repeatedly cited for excessive noise while playing in the community playground during posted hours. Sarah Williams left after being fined for unauthorized gardening activities when she planted native wildflowers in her assigned garden plot. James Patterson faced constant violations for his weekend classic car restoration hobby, despite working only in his enclosed garage. The pattern was clear. Anyone whose lifestyle or activities did not match Karen Stephanie's vision of suburban perfection faced systematic harassment until they gave up and left. She told me directly that families with young children were lowering property values, Sarah Williams explained during our phone conversation. She wanted Willowbrook to be a quiet retirement community, not a place for working families. But I was not dealing with just personal harassment anymore. The environmental testing results arrived 3 weeks after the fish kill, and they were damning. Chlorine levels in the lake water were 8 times higher than federal safety standards for aquatic ecosystems. The contamination was so severe that it posed risks to any wildlife that might drink from the lake. Armed with federal environmental violations, I filed an amended complaint with the EPA that triggered a formal investigation. Suddenly, agencies that had been unresponsive to a resident complaint were very interested in potential federal crimes. Karen Stephanie's next escalation revealed her desperation. She attempted to have me evicted through fraudulent lease violations, claiming I had violated occupancy terms by conducting business activities from my apartment. My job search activities, including phone interviews and document preparation, were allegedly commercial use of residential space. My landlord, fortunately, was not intimidated by HOA pressure and refused to pursue eviction without legitimate cause. But the harassment campaign had attracted attention from other residents who had remained silent out of fear. I began receiving anonymous notes of support and offers to provide witness testimony about their own experiences with HOA intimidation. The suburban battlefield was expanding, and Karen Stephanie was about to discover that environmental terrorism carries consequences far beyond community politics. The EPA investigation transformed my small community dispute into a federal case that would reshape HOA environmental accountability nationwide. Agent Maria Santos arrived on a cold November morning with a team of environmental specialists and legal authority that Karen Stephanie had never encountered before. I watched from my balcony as the federal investigators set up water testing equipment around the lake. Karen appeared on her back patio repeatedly, clearly agitated by the official attention, but unable to interfere with federal agents conducting their work. Agent Santos interviewed me for 3 hours, recording every detail of the harassment campaign and the environmental destruction. She was particularly interested in the financial records I had obtained through public records requests. Environmental crimes often involve financial motives, she explained. If the HOA diverted maintenance funds to eliminate activities they considered undesirable, that could constitute conspiracy to commit environmental terrorism. The financial investigation revealed shocking levels of corruption. The HOA had collected over $40,000 annually from residents for lake maintenance and environmental stewardship. Instead of using these funds for legitimate ecosystem management, they had paid for systematic chemical treatments designed to eliminate fish populations and discourage recreational use. The paper trail led to Superior Environmental Solutions, a company owned by Karen Stephanie's brother-in-law. This supposed environmental services company had no legitimate credentials, no proper equipment, and no record of actual environmental work. It existed solely to launder HOA funds into payments for chemical dumping designed to eliminate fishing. But the corruption went deeper than financial fraud. Discovery documents revealed email communications between Karen and several HOA board members discussing the fishing problem and strategies to eliminate undesirable resident activities. One email from Karen to board member Robert Chen was particularly damning. The fishing situation is impacting our property values and community image. We need permanent solutions that do not involve lengthy rule change processes. I have identified cost-effective methods to address this issue. Another email thread discussed concerns about working-class residents who might lower the tone of the community. Karen had apparently researched my employment history and concluded that unemployed residents reflected poorly on Willowbrook's prestige. The environmental investigation expanded when Agent Santos discovered evidence of similar contamination in the community's smaller decorative ponds. Chemical testing revealed that the HOA had been using industrial bleach treatments to eliminate algae and aquatic plants in all water features, creating toxic conditions throughout the entire ecosystem. This is not isolated vandalism, Agent Santos informed me. This appears to be systematic environmental destruction motivated by aesthetic preferences and social discrimination. Meanwhile, Karen escalated her personal harassment campaign to dangerous levels. She filed false police reports claiming I had threatened her during encounters that were captured on security cameras showing no such interactions. She attempted to have my car towed by claiming it was abandoned, despite daily use for job interviews. Her most disturbing escalation came when she tried to have me declared mentally unstable. She filed formal complaints with county social services claiming my obsession with fishing and paranoid concerns about water quality indicated psychological problems requiring intervention. The social services investigation lasted one afternoon and concluded that I was responding rationally to legitimate environmental and harassment concerns. But the attempt to use mental health services as weapons revealed the depths of Karen's desperation and cruelty. Media attention began building as environmental groups recognized the broader implications of the case. The Sierra Club issued a statement supporting my complaint and calling for stronger federal oversight of HOA environmental management. Local news stations picked up the story as an example of suburban environmental crimes. The publicity triggered a flood of similar complaints from other communities, where HOAs had used chemical treatments to eliminate wildlife or recreational activities deemed undesirable. The case was becoming a symbol of broader conflicts between private community management and environmental protection. Karen's legal troubles multiplied when the EPA investigation revealed that she had personally purchased and transported the bleach used in the lake contamination. Credit card records showed purchases of commercial-grade bleach from multiple suppliers, apparently to avoid detection through large single purchases. Security camera footage from a local hardware store captured her loading bleach containers into her luxury SUV just hours before the fish kill. The premeditation was undeniable. The HOA board finally began distancing themselves from Karen's actions when they realized the personal legal liability they faced. Board member resignations arrived weekly as members tried to avoid association with environmental crimes. But the investigation had revealed systemic problems that went far beyond one person's extremism. The entire HOA structure had enabled and funded environmental terrorism through lack of oversight and accountability. The federal hammer was about to fall, and Karen Stephanie was about to learn that poisoning lakes carries consequences that HOA authority cannot protect against. December brought federal justice with the swift efficiency that only environmental crime prosecutions can deliver. The EPA issued an immediate lake closure order that transformed Willowbrook's crown jewel into a federal hazmat site overnight. I stood on my balcony watching yellow caution tape flutter around the contaminated water as specialists in protective gear collected evidence samples. The lake that Karen Stephanie had poisoned to maintain her vision of suburban perfection now looked like a crime scene, because that was exactly what it had become. The closure notice, posted in stark black letters on official federal signs, announced that Willowbrook Lake was contaminated with dangerous chemicals that posed risks to human health and wildlife safety. Swimming, fishing, and even contact with the water were prohibited until comprehensive environmental remediation could be completed. Karen's confident facade finally cracked when federal agents arrived at her door with arrest warrants. I watched from across the street as she was led away in handcuffs, her designer outfit no match for federal custody. The woman who had terrorized residents through HOA authority was now facing criminal charges that HOA politics could not influence. The charges were serious: conspiracy to commit environmental terrorism, violation of federal water quality standards, fraud involving the misuse of community funds, and filing false reports with federal agencies. Each charge carried potential prison time and substantial financial penalties. But Karen's personal legal troubles were only the beginning of the consequences, cascading through Willowbrook Estates. The environmental remediation estimate arrived like a financial earthquake: $2.4 million to restore the lake ecosystem to federal safety standards. The contamination was so severe that complete water replacement and soil remediation would be necessary before aquatic life could safely return. The HOA treasury contained less than $80,000. The community association was immediately bankrupt, unable to fund even basic maintenance, much less environmental restoration mandated by federal authorities. Property values collapsed as news spread that Willowbrook was built around a toxic waste site, requiring millions in cleanup costs. The exclusive community that had justified premium housing prices was now a cautionary tale about environmental crimes and financial fraud. Current residents faced special assessments averaging $15,000 per household to fund the mandatory cleanup. Many chose to sell at substantial losses rather than pay for environmental restoration they had not caused. The HOA board's panicked attempts to save themselves by blaming Karen exclusively failed when federal investigators revealed the systematic nature of the environmental violations. Board meeting minutes showed that multiple members had knowledge of and voted to fund the chemical treatments that destroyed the lake ecosystem. Criminal charges expanded to include conspiracy and fraud counts against 3 additional board members who had participated in diverting maintenance funds to Karen's fake environmental services company. The federal case established legal precedent that would protect communities nationwide from similar HOA environmental abuse. Environmental groups hailed the prosecutions as landmark victories for ecosystem protection against private authority overreach. But the personal impact on Karen Stephanie was devastating in ways that went far beyond legal consequences. Her husband filed for divorce, citing the financial liability and criminal charges that threatened their family's future. Her adult children publicly distanced themselves from her actions and refused to provide financial support for her legal defense. The woman who had wielded HOA authority like a weapon to control her neighbors' lives was now facing federal prison time, personal bankruptcy, and complete social isolation. The lake closure also revealed the extent of ecological damage that years of chemical treatments had caused. Environmental specialists discovered that the contamination extended into groundwater systems that supplied drinking water to adjacent communities. Federal authorities opened additional investigations into environmental violations at other properties, managed by the same HOA management company that had enabled Karen's activities. The case was becoming a symbol of how unchecked private authority could cause environmental destruction that affected entire regions, not just individual communities. As I watched the federal cleanup crews begin draining the poison lake, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was being served, but the ecosystem that had provided my sanctuary was gone, replaced by an industrial remediation project that would take years to complete. Karen Stephanie had gotten exactly what she wanted: no more fishing at Willowbrook Lake. But the price of that victory was her freedom, her fortune, and her future. 6 months later, I stood on the newly constructed dock watching fish jump in crystal clear water that sparkled brighter than ever before. The federal remediation project had not just restored Willowbrook Lake, it had created an ecosystem healthier and more vibrant than anyone had imagined possible. Karen Stephanie was serving 18 months in federal prison for environmental terrorism and conspiracy charges. The judge had been particularly harsh during sentencing, noting that her actions represented a betrayal of community trust and environmental stewardship that demanded significant consequences. Her personal financial penalties exceeded $500,000 in restitution payments, EPA fines, and legal costs. The environmental services company operated by her brother-in-law was permanently shut down and fined an additional $200,000 for fraudulent environmental practices. The HOA itself had been dissolved and replaced with a resident-managed community association focused on transparent governance and environmental protection. I had been elected to the new Environmental Oversight Committee, helping establish monitoring protocols that would prevent future abuse. The lake restoration had become a model for community environmental management. Federal oversight ensured that proper ecosystem balance was maintained through scientific methods rather than chemical shortcuts. Native fish populations had returned in greater abundance than before the contamination, as if nature itself was celebrating the victory over those who had tried to poison it for profit. My role in the community had evolved from victim to environmental advocate. I worked with federal agents to develop educational programs, helping other communities recognize and report similar HOA environmental violations. The legal precedent established by our case had empowered residents nationwide to challenge HOA environmental abuse. Similar prosecutions were initiated in communities across the country, where chemical treatments and ecosystem destruction had been used to eliminate recreational activities or wildlife. Early morning fishing sessions resumed with deeper appreciation for the fragility and resilience of natural systems. The bass and bluegill that now thrived in the restored lake represented more than recreational opportunities. They were living proof that environmental justice was possible when ordinary people refused to accept institutional abuse. The community itself had been transformed by the experience. Residents who had remained silent during Karen's reign of harassment now participated actively in governance and environmental protection. The culture of fear and intimidation had been replaced by cooperation and shared responsibility. Property values eventually recovered, as Willowbrook became known for environmental excellence rather than ecological destruction. The federal oversight and restoration had created a genuinely sustainable community that attracted environmentally conscious residents. But the most important lesson was personal. I had learned that individual courage, when armed with documentation and legal persistence, could defeat even well-funded institutional corruption. The unemployed man who had once felt powerless against HOA authority had successfully prosecuted federal environmental crimes and restored an entire ecosystem. The morning I caught my first bass in the restored lake, I reflected on how far we had all come. Karen Stephanie had tried to eliminate fishing through environmental terrorism, but instead had created a thriving aquatic sanctuary monitored by federal environmental standards. Her attempt to control nature through poison had backfired spectacularly, resulting in environmental protections stronger than anything I could have achieved through normal channels. As I released that first bass back into the clear water, I realized that sometimes the greatest victories come from defending what you love against those who would destroy it for their own convenience. The lake was more beautiful than ever, the fish were more abundant than before, and the community had learned that environmental stewardship requires eternal vigilance against those who mistake authority for the right to cause harm. Karen Stephanie had wanted to eliminate fishing from Willowbrook Lake. Instead, she had created the finest fishing destination in the county, protected by federal oversight and maintained by residents who would never again allow environmental terrorism to masquerade as community management. Justice had been served, the ecosystem had been restored, and the lake would remain a sanctuary for generations to come.